Hey everyone, welcome to Mad Backyard. Today I'm going to show you how to make pork spare ribs on your Pit Boss pellet grill. We're going to show you how to trim, season, and smoke your ribs on a Pit Boss, or any pellet grill for that matter, and get maximum flavor and tenderness. Okay guys, I'm just going to come out and say it. The 3-2-1 method is still king when it comes to smoking pork ribs, with a few minor tweaks. You see, instead of going by time, I'm going to show you how to use temperature so that you can dial in your ribs and get them to come out exactly the way you like them every single time. Pork spare ribs are different than the baby back ribs we did in a previous video. Baby backs are leaner and come more from the back of the hog, while spare ribs are a little fattier but also a little more flavorful, take a little longer to cook, and come more from the front of the hog. When you go to buy your ribs, you may see some that are just called spare ribs, and these are untrimmed full racks of spare ribs, but I like to look for the ones that say St. Louis cut spare ribs. All St. Louis cut or St. Louis style means is that they've cut off some of the excess meat and cartilage around the outside of the full rack of spare ribs, making it just a cleaner, more easy to handle rack of ribs. Most of the racks of St. Louis cut spare ribs I saw at the store last night were about 3 to 3.5 pounds, while the full racks of spare ribs that were untrimmed were closer to 5 pounds. For me personally, rather than getting a full 5 to 5.5 pound rack of untrimmed spare ribs, I'd rather get 2, 3 to 3.5 pound racks of St. Louis cut spare ribs. Trim off some of the excess fat from your spare ribs using a good boning knife like this one from a Marku. You don't have to go crazy trying to trim off all the fat. Just try to get off any hard chunks and big scraggly pieces that are hanging off from the top and the bottom. Leaving some in place is good, as the surface fat will render and help keep everything moist as we cook. Next, you want to remove this outer membrane from the bottom of the spare ribs. This membrane can block our seasoning from penetrating the meat, as well as keep the fat from rendering out. Some people just score it with a knife to help the fat render through, but I like to just remove the whole thing. The easiest way is to use a paper towel to keep a good grip. Work one of the corners loose and then pull from one end to the other. You'll see another thinner membrane under this one that you don't want to pull off. You can tell because if you start to pull back on this membrane, you'll see the bones directly exposed. If you take off this membrane, your ribs will likely fall apart as they're cooking, so make sure to leave it in place. We're going to use 2 kinds of seasoning today on our spare ribs. The first one is Cosmo's Dirty Bird Dry Rub. I like this rub because it's nice and savory and garlicky and has a little bit of heat on the back end as well. The second rub is Three Little Pigs Touch of Cherry, which I really like on pork ribs. It's a sweeter rub with a lot more sugar in it than the Dirty Bird. When I'm seasoning ribs, I like to put the saltier, savory rub on first so the salt can really penetrate the meat and season it. I then put the sweeter, sugary rub on the outside to help set up the bark and get a nice color from all the sugars. Season both sides well, but don't go overboard. Ribs have a lot of surface area relative to the amount of meat in them, so it's easy to overdo it. Also, the more you cake on the seasoning, the less smoke flavor can penetrate the meat while it's cooking in the smoker. Make sure to get under any flaps of meat to get those areas seasoned, and also the sides of the ribs too. Let the rubs set up for about 15 to 20 minutes, as this will give it time to pull some moisture out and create a nice paste on the outside of the ribs. This paste will help form a better bark as they cook, and the moisture will absorb more smoke flavor right in the beginning while the meat is still cold. I'm going to use these Expert Grill brand pellets in the hopper today. They were on a really good sale at Walmart last night, and I couldn't help myself. They make really quality pellets, and they put out a nice smoke and consistent heat at these low to mid-range temperatures. Make sure to always transfer your new pellets to an airtight storage container. If you watch our channel, you know we love these ones from Oklahoma Joe's because of the mesh screen inside. This allows you to shake out the sawdust before pouring them in the hopper, which will give you a cleaner, more consistent burn. As we showed in our video on how to get more smoke from your pellet grill, pellets will last a lot longer and perform better if you keep them in a nice, dry, airtight storage container when you're not using them, rather than leaving them in the bag. I set up my Pit Boss with the flame tamer over the fire pot to help give us some more heat diffusion in the center. If you haven't watched our video on how to fix hot spots and Pit Boss temperature problems, make sure to check that out as well. Because we're using indirect heat on our ribs, I want to cut down on the direct heat from the fire pot in the center as much as possible. Next, go ahead and turn on your Pit Boss and let it run through the startup cycle with the lid open. Then for our spare ribs, we're going to set our temperature to 270 degrees. I've cooked spare ribs at both hotter and lower temperatures in the past, but found that cooking around 270 degrees really renders the fat nicely, gets them done without taking all day, and doesn't dry them out or burn the ends. Let's talk about how we're setting up our Pit Boss to cook these spare ribs. I've got the top rack in place. We're going to cook our ribs on the top rack so that on the bottom rack we can put our water pan. The water pan actually serves 2 functions. First, it's obviously going to provide some moisture to the cooking chamber and help prevent our ribs from drying out as easily. But more importantly, the water is going to act as another level of heat diffusion to help block that direct heat in the center of our pellet grill. Using a water pan in any kind of smoker will usually act as a heat sink and keep the inside temperature of the cooking chamber from fluctuating as much. The last part of our setup for our spare ribs is going to be using a pellet tube smoker to get some extra smoke flavor during the first stage of the cook. As I showed in our video on how to get more smoke flavor using a pellet tube smoker, I like to save my more quality and expensive pellets, such as these Knotty Wood plum pellets I'm using today, in my pellet tube smoker rather than the hopper. In addition, I'm going to mix a few tiny cherry wood chips in with the Knotty Wood pellets. This will provide just a little bit different combustion and a little more interesting flavors in the smoke we're putting on our ribs. If you're going to mix wood chips in with pellets in a pellet tube smoker, don't use a ton. If you use too many wood chips in with your pellets, they can catch fire and ignite rather than smolder and smoke. I find just mixing a small amount of tiny wood chip scraps in the pellet tube smoker with the pellets works just fine. Also, don't soak the wood chips because that moisture will just transfer to the pellets and they either won't light or won't smoke very well. Make sure to watch that full video on how to light the pellet tube smoker for more step-by-step instructions on how to set it up for adding more smoke to your ribs and other foods. I'll put a link to it down in the description below. Okay, the seasoning has had some time to set on the ribs. You can see we've got a nice paste on the outside now. That's what we want because that moisture is really going to absorb a lot of our smoke flavor. So I'm going to go ahead and put these on the top rack. You can see I'm wearing my nitrile gloves with my cloth liners underneath. This makes it a lot easier for handling meat, especially once the meat gets hot, rather than trying to mess with tongs and spatulas and things for moving your barbecue around. This side is the bigger side, as you can see. I'm going to put that more towards the left. On my particular Pit Boss, I've found that the left side gets a little warmer than the right side, so it's just nicer to put the bigger pieces of meat over on that side. We're going to go ahead and gently put it on here right over the water pot, or the water pan. And then once I put it on, I'm going to smush it together a little bit, just as that meat likes to contract once it starts warming up anyway, and that way it'll keep it from moving around too much and possibly tearing, but we don't have to worry about that for a little while. We're just gonna let this go here for a little while and we'll check on it in a little bit. Okay, now that we have the ribs on, let's talk a little bit about how long we're gonna cook them for. You've probably heard of the 3-2-1 method, and if you're not familiar, all this means is that you cook the ribs for 3 hours with smoke unwrapped, then 2 hours wrapped in foil in order to get the meat nice and tender, and then 1 hour back on the smoker unwrapped to firm them back up before you serve them. There's 1,000 articles on the web and videos on YouTube talking about whether the 3-2-1 method is good or bad or outdated, or whether you should always use it or never use it, but here's my opinion on it. The problem with the 3-2-1 method is that it's only addressing time. Think about it this way. If someone came up to you and said, the best way to cook chicken is to cook it for 45 minutes, you might say, okay, maybe, but what kind of chicken is it? What are you cooking it in? What kind of smoker? And what temperature are you cooking it at? Those are all going to affect how long you cook that chicken for. The same is true with ribs. You can't just say, cook it 3 hours this way, 2 hours this way, and 1 hour this way, and they will always turn out well. There's a lot of other variables at play. Now, some people are so against the 3-2-1 method that they don't wrap their ribs at all. I've tried that in the past, and I haven't been a fan of ribs that aren't wrapped. They just don't come out as tender for me, and they definitely don't pull away from the bone. So what I like to do is still follow the 3-2-1 method, but not pay so much attention to the numbers themselves. We still start the ribs off for the first 3 hours or so with smoke, unwrapped. Then we wrap them, but we're gonna let temperature be our guide, not so much time. And then we'll put them back on the Pit Boss at the end to firm back up, but they usually don't need a full hour. So we'll get into all that here next. But let's let our ribs smoke for a while, and we'll come back and look at them in a little bit. It's been about an hour and a half since we put the spare ribs on. Let's see how they're looking. So we can go ahead and kind of pull the top rack out towards us a little bit to get a better look at them. You'll see that the bark is starting to set up on here now. If I rub my finger across it, I'm not moving seasoning around anymore. It's staying in place. That's what we want to start to happen as the bark forms in this first stage. Now, they're still not ready to be wrapped yet. What we're looking for is a darker, more amber color on them. But at the same time, during this stage, we also don't want the meat on the top to start to dry out. So I'm going to spray it with a little bit of half apple cider vinegar, half water. I find that straight apple cider vinegar is a little too much, so I can cut it with water to kind of tone down that vinegariness. But you can really use anything. You can use straight water if you want, or you can use cola or apple juice, just really anything to kind of keep that outside nice and moist during this first stage here. Now, we haven't gotten to the fat rendering stage yet. That starts to happen when the meat gets to about 150, 160 degrees. right now we're probably, I'm guessing around, yeah, we're in the kind of mid 130s right there. So still got a little ways to go in this first stage. We'll kind of keep spraying it every 30-40 minutes or so just to keep that top nice and moist. We don't want to get any big splits. We got little bits here is fine here and there. You can always add a little more seasoning as you go to fill in those areas, but we don't want any big splits in the pork as it dries out. So keep it nice and moist, and we'll come back and check on it in about another half hour or so. It's been about 2.5 hours since we put the pork spare ribs on. What I did is I came out a little while ago and I rotated them so that the larger side is now on the right. I noticed some more fat rendering on this side versus this side, and it was pulling away from the bones a little bit too. So those are little keys you can look for to see if one side of your ribs are cooking faster than the others, along with using your Thermapen. So we're just gonna check the middle now. Yeah, we're still in the 140 range. My pellet tube smoker has pretty much burnt out at this point. I'm only getting some white dirty smoke. So I'm gonna go ahead and take that off as well. We're gonna spray these one more time, let them get a little darker, let some more fat render, and then we'll go ahead and wrap them. We're now at the 3.5 hour mark since we put our pork spare ribs on the Pit Boss. So I wanna show you how they're looking at this point and how we know it's time to take them off. So pull them a little forward here into the sun so you can see them a little better. So you can see we've got a nice dark amber color on the outside. You can also see that across the entire set of spare ribs, most of our surface fat has rendered out. That's these little pools right here. That doesn't mean all the fat on the inside is rendered out by any means whatsoever yet, but that's kind of a clue that they're starting to be done. So about 3.5 hours at this point. Now you may cook yours at a little lower temperature. They might take a little longer. Your Pit Boss may run a little hotter than mine, and they may not take as long, but rather than going dogmatically by 3 hours on the first stage, we want to look for them to look like this when we're done. So at this point, when they're in that 155 to 170 range, this is what's called the stall. So they're basically just gonna kind of stall out at this temperature until a lot of water evaporates from the meat contracts more, and then only at that point can they start rising in temperature more. And above 170 is really where the fat and collagen starts to break down. You can think of the fat and collagen kind of as the glue that holds the meat to the bone. So when people talk about having fall off the bone ribs, you've really got to cook the ribs until all that fat and collagen on the inside of the ribs melts, just like we're seeing the surface fat melt on the outside of our ribs. Now we could just leave them on here and they would continue to cook, and they would eventually get to a high enough internal temperature where all that fat and collagen has melted on the inside and they're easier to eat and more fall off the bone. But a better way to do it is to wrap them in foil for the second stage. So we talked about this in the beginning, how if you follow the classic 3-2-1 method, would say to just leave them in the foil for 2 hours. We're gonna get these off the Pit Boss, put them in the foil, and show you a better way to do it. When it's time to wrap your ribs, this is how I like to do it. I take 2 sheets of aluminum foil so that they're double wrapped, and I put them inside of an aluminum pan like this. That way if I do get a puncture or anything like that, the juices don't run everywhere all over the table and everything's kind of contained. So I'm gonna kind of flatten them out here. And then in the bottom of the aluminum foil, we're gonna add some ingredients. As you saw from our baby back ribs, it worked really well to put some butter. And who doesn't like butter? So we're gonna put some butter in the bottom. We're gonna drizzle a little bit of honey on top of that. A little extra sweetness. And then what I like to do lately is I take some of the sauce we're gonna use. We're gonna be using this Blues Hog Champions blend. If you watch this channel, you know we love everything by Blues Hog, but especially their sauces. The Champions blend is just a great all-around barbecue sauce, and I love it on pork spare ribs. So I was not gonna just put some straight barbecue sauce in there. What I did instead is I mixed it with a little bit of apple cider vinegar. Now, having this little extra apple cider vinegar gives you a little more acidity, a little more tang, and that goes a long way on the ribs when you've got that little extra bit of acidic bite to kind of cut through the fat and salt and sugar and everything else that we've got plenty of already on the ribs. So I'm going to put a little bit on the bottom. I put about half a cup of sauce in this measuring cup, and then about 2 tablespoons of apple cider vinegar, and stir it around. So I'm putting half on the bottom here. And now we're going to take our ribs and we're going to put them face down in this mixture we've made. So I have our ribs, gently place them over this way, so that meat is right on top of the butter and all the honey and sauce. Then we're gonna take the rest of our sauce and drizzle it across the back as well. We're gonna take the first layer of aluminum foil and wrap it over the ribs. nice and tight against the meat. And when we're wrapping this, we want to think about that we want to be able to check our temperature here as they cook. So you don't want to wrap them in such a way that you can't open them back up easily and get back at them. So rather than taking this part and folding it over, I'm now going to take the second one and put this on top as well. And then this part. Get it nice and tight on there, and now I'm going to take the edges and fold them over this way. That way when we go to check our temperature, it's real easy to just pull these open, pull it open, check it real quick, and then fold it back up as we need to. So our pit boss is still running at 270. We haven't changed anything as far as temperature. I'm gonna open it back up here, and I'm gonna leave the water pan here, not because we're gonna get moisture. We're gonna get plenty of moisture inside the foil as is, but leave it there just so that we get still that heat diffusion we want from the fire pot underneath. So I'm gonna take the rack of ribs now wrapped in foil and put it right back where it was, and you'll notice the ribs are still upside down. I want that meat to kind of baste inside the butter and the sauce and the honey and everything we put on the bottom there. So ribs are upside down inside the foil. When we go to check the temperature later, just pull it out, open it up, check it, and you can be on your way, get it wrapped back up and back in the pit boss. So the first stage was smoking our ribs, getting that bark nice and firm and getting a lot of smoke flavor on the spare ribs. The second stage we're in now is the wrap stage. The point of this stage is to really increase that internal temperature of our ribs like we talked about, to get the fat and collagen to break down and get them up to a good internal temperature where all that fat and collagen breaks down so that the ribs fall off the bone. Now there's a lot of reasons that people hate on the 3-2-1 method, but the main reason is because people have a lot of disagreements over how long the ribs should be wrapped or if they should be wrapped at all. Now I like them wrapped because I think they're more tender and fall off the bone style when I wrap them versus when I don't, but the debate is really how long they should be wrapped. Now if you follow the classic 3-2-1 method, you would keep them wrapped for 2 hours, but like we talked about, that doesn't take into consideration what temperature you're cooking the ribs at, what type of smoker you're using, whether they're baby backs or spare ribs, or even just your personal preference. Maybe you want a little more chew to your ribs, maybe you want to have them a little tougher to pull away from the bone, maybe you want them completely falling apart. Or maybe you're just somewhere in the middle. So just doing for 2 hours blindly doesn't take any of that into consideration. So a better way to track them when they're in this stage is by using your instant thermometer. If you take them out at 190, they're going to be more competition style where they stick to the bone and you get a good solid bite through. If you let them go all the way up to 205, they'll still stick to the bone, but they're gonna pull away a little easier. If you really want fall off the bone, like literal fall off the bone style ribs, let them go all the way up to about 210 or so. Once you unwrap them and for the third stage put them back on the pit boss, they will never go higher in temperature again, at least not anytime soon. So once you unwrap them from the foil, they're actually gonna start to drop in temperature. So you need to keep them in the foil all the way until they hit that perfect temperature for you. Likely, if you've never done it before, you're going to prefer them somewhere in the 200 to 205 range. If you really want them to fall off the bone, like I said, go all the way to 210. But if it's your first time, I'd recommend 200 to 205. So they were still only at 165 when we put them on. They got to power through the stall and rise up in temperature a little more. So I'm going to leave them alone for at least an hour, and then we'll check them just to kind of get a gauge of where we're at that point. We're about 1 hour into the second stage now. We're gonna open them up and just take a look at where our temperature is. They're starting to look good. I don't think they're gonna be quite done yet, but we'll get an idea of where the temperature is and how fast they're moving. So I'm gonna check with my instant thermometer. I wanna look, you don't wanna just check right in this little flap of meat here. You wanna really get in between the bones in the middle, right there. We're still at about 180 or so. So like I said, we're trying to get up to about 200 degrees in total. So that's the very center there. If we kind of check the edges over here, a little higher, closer to 190 there. Make sure you're not touching right up against a bone. And a little less on the right side. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap these back up and then turn them, because this side's cooking a little faster, just like it was doing during the first stage. So we're wrapping back up, and at this point we're probably going to check every 20 minutes to half hour just to see where we are so we don't overshoot it. Okay, we checked it after about 20 minutes and it had moved up a little bit, but not quite to where we want it. We're now at an hour and 45 minutes, and we're going to check again and see where we are. So let's go ahead and open up the wrap here. These smell so good. I think these are, I'm guessing they're gonna be ready. You can see how they're really pulling away from the bone on this side that was cooking a little faster. So let's go ahead and check our internal temperature right between the bones there. Yeah, we're getting close to that 200 mark, about 197. Let's check some of the edges. Yeah, those are definitely getting up right in that range we want, that 200 to 205. If we check this side, this is probably gonna be even higher. Maybe not. About 200. Almost 200 there. That's close enough for me, especially because these edges are starting to cook a little faster than the middle and getting a little further along than I would want to push them too much more. So we're going to take this whole boat of ribs and sauce and everything else, and we're going to move it back over to our aluminum foil pan. Now for the final stage, we're going to move the ribs back onto the Pit Boss unwrapped. So just carefully bring it over nice and close. We're gonna keep that side that's cooking a little faster over to the right and get these back on and get that bark to firm back up there. Make sure to save these drippings here that we left in the foil because we can add them to our barbecue sauce and give our sauce a little extra flavor. If we followed the conventional 3-2-1 method, we would leave the spare ribs on during this final stage for an entire hour. However, I found you really only need to leave them on during this stage long enough that the bark sets back up. If you lost any of your bark during the second stage, you can add a little rub back to the ribs and give it some time to reset on the meat. This usually only takes about 20 to 30 minutes. If you leave them on longer than that, you risk drying out the meat. At this point, we've rendered out most, if not all, of the fat and collagen on the inside of the spare ribs. You'll be able to see the bones separate more easily from the meat, and you have more fat dripping down when you push on the ribs. While they will continue to tenderize a little bit during this stage, the longer you leave them on, the more you risk drying them out. So just give them long enough for the bark to set back up while you get your sauce ready. Today I'm using Blues Hog Champions blend. I usually mix a couple spoonfuls of juices from the foil wrap into the sauce just to give it a little more richness. Once the bark is set back up on the ribs, go ahead and brush on your sauce using a silicone basting brush. Now leave the ribs on for another 15 minutes just to get the sauce warm and tacky, and then remove them from the smoker. Transfer the ribs to a cutting board and use a good meat slicing knife like this one from Marico to carve your ribs. You can see that these ribs came out incredibly tender and juicy. All the fat and collagen has rendered down, and we can now easily pull the meat cleanly away from the bone, but they aren't falling apart either as we took them off the smoker at around 200 degrees. This is exactly how I like my ribs done. And by using an instant thermometer and temperature as a guide rather than time, I know that they will come out exactly like this every single time. So these look extremely tender and juicy, and most important, what I'm happiest with is that the meat is pulling away from the bone, but it's not completely falling apart off the bone. So let's go ahead and take a taste and see how we did. It just has everything you would want in a rib. You immediately breathe in a little bit of that smoky flavor, hits the back of your palate. You take a bite, you get tons of flavor from those rubs we used, the touch of cherry, 3 little pigs, and then you get a little bit of heat at the end from that Dirty Bird rub as well. Plenty of sweetness from the sauce and the honey and everything. But most importantly, it's got that little hit of acidity from the apple cider vinegar we used, both when we sprayed and then also when we wrapped it in foil. So it's just cutting through everything and just firing on all cylinders. These are delicious. So I still maintain that the method behind the 3-2-1 method is still king, but you need to go by temperature and not time. On pork spare ribs for the first stage, yes, you are gonna cook for about 3 hours. We ended up going 3.5 hours, and you wanna get a nice amber color, you wanna get that bark set up, and you want your internal temperature to get to about 160 degrees where that fat's just starting to render and you're hitting the stall. For the second stage, you're gonna double wrap tightly in aluminum foil, and then it's really just gonna come down to how you like your ribs. If you want them pulling off the bone, aim for a final temperature of 195 to 200 degrees. If you want them really falling off the bone completely, let them sit in the wrap for a little longer. You're gonna go more to 205 to 210 degrees even. It's really up to you. It may take 2 hours, it may take less, it may take more. And for the final stage, we put the pork spare ribs back on the Pit Boss. They don't necessarily need a full hour back on, maybe 30 minutes or so to just let that bark set back up. Add your sauce for another 15 minutes, and then you can slice and enjoy your ribs. And if you follow these guidelines and use a good instant read thermometer, they should come out exactly how you like them every single time. We hope you enjoyed this video. We'd appreciate if you hit the like and subscribe button, and you can check out the full step-by-step recipe that accompanies this video at madbackyard.com. I'll put a link down in the description below, along with links to all the other videos I mentioned today, as well as products we used, if you want to check those out too. And let us know in the comments section how you like to make your pork spare ribs. Are you a fan of the 3-2-1 method, or do you use something else? We'd love to hear your methods. We're always looking for new ideas and love to try new things. And as always, thanks for watching. And hey, thanks for watching. And thanks for watching. Thanks for watching. Watching. Okay.